Hello, and thank you for spending time to watch this presentation. I'm Lisa Posas, Head of Research Services and Archives at the Autry Museum of the American West. Supported by generous funding from the Society of American Archivists Foundation, the Autry is collaboratively developing a Where Repatriation Meets the Protocols workbook that focuses on the intersecting activities between the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act process, or NAGPRA process, and the Protocols for Native American Archival Materials, also known as PNAAM or the Protocols. As a first step, a survey was distributed to those who are or may be associated with these activities, including, but not limited to, tribal groups, tribal historic preservation officers or THPO officers, NAGPRA coordinators, librarians, archivists, archaeologists, and museum professionals. Before my colleagues, Cristina Hummel-Kola, Library Collections Assistant, and Alejandra Gueda, Associate Archivist and Librarian, share the results of the survey, I would like to give some background about the project and survey development. As said earlier, the project was funded by the SAA Foundation, and initially the timeline was to be from October 2019 to December 2020. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, activities planned for this project were derailed, requiring for an extended deadline of June 2021. Nonetheless, the workbook goal of developing a resource that can serve as a solid start to a living document that will guide entities working with archives as part of their repatriation efforts has not changed. The Autry is also working with an external advisory group that includes members from tribal, academic, and government organizations, as well as holding separate tribal consultations. Public discussion forums are also being held once a month from December 2020 to June 2021 to discuss the different sections of the workbook as they develop. We distributed a survey in October 2020. The goal of the survey was to better assess the levels of preparedness different entities have when working with archival collections during the NAGPRA process. The survey consists of 14 questions. The first two asking responders about their affiliation and their role or roles associated with that affiliation. The next group of questions are asked to gauge the responders' understanding of both NAGPRA and PNAAM, followed by questions concerning archive collections management, as well as how these archives can assist with the different aspects of the NAGPRA process. We also wanted to give responders a space to elaborate more about their experiences that may not be accurately caught with a basic question and multiple choice answer format. The next question provided a matrix for responders to fill out that specifically addressed the existence of current policies, procedures, and guidelines that they might have. A question about resources was also asked. Then finally, questions regarding challenges and an opportunity to reach out to the project organizers ended the survey. Data from the survey is crucial when examining the range of existing policies, procedures, and practices that will influence the development of the workbook. We sent a link to the online survey to various professional distribution lists and directly to colleagues and kept it up for 6 weeks. Despite these attempts, only 26 responses were received. However small the sampling, the responses were analyzed in earnest in case they can serve as a viable microcosm of the different fields and communities who did complete the survey. Cristina Hummel-Kola will next share the general results of the survey, to be followed by Alejandra Gueda to provide more detailed correlation observations based on the results.
Good afternoon. I'm Cristina Hummel-Kola, Library Collections Assistant at the Autry Museum, working on Where Repatriation Meets the Protocols workbook with Lisa and Alejandra. So to begin with, we asked all of our respondents to reply to the question, what type of organization or entity are you affiliated with? And we asked them to select all that might apply. So by and large, our respondents were affiliated with archives at 38%, and then a close to even split between libraries at 25%, museums at 22%, and a smaller group that identified as other, which included a gallery, a national nonprofit, and special collections. And then our smallest group of respondents to the survey were affiliated with a tribal group at 6%. We next asked our respondents to respond, please select the title that best represents your professional role. And again, we asked them to select all that apply. We saw complementing the archives affiliation that 67% of our respondents are archivists. The next largest group identified as other, and they specified themselves as a volunteer docent, a special collections librarian, a curator of collections, a collections manager, and a library director. After that, we had 7% of our respondents were NAGPRA officers, and then the rest were split evenly between tribal historic preservation officers and archaeologists. We next asked our respondents how familiar they are with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and most of our respondents said that they were somewhat familiar with NAGPRA. Then we had the next largest category said that they were extremely familiar, very familiar, and then a smaller proportion of respondents said that they were not so familiar or not at all familiar. Next, we asked how familiar they are with protocols for Native American Archival Materials, or PNAAM, and we saw a shift here. Far more of our respondents said that they were extremely familiar with PNAAM, with the next largest group saying they were somewhat familiar. And then finally, some respondents said that they weren't at all familiar or not so familiar. Next, we asked, does your institution have archive collections that can assist in providing evidence with NAGPRA claims? Here we saw that 2/3 of our respondents were uncertain if their collections could assist in providing evidence. And then in addition to that, we saw an even split between respondents who said yes, they did, and those who said no, they did not. We next asked if an institution did have archival collections that could assist with NAGPRA claims, what situation best describes where those collections are held? And over half of our respondents said that those collections would be held in their library and archive repository, and 13% said that those records would be part of acquisitions donor files. 9% said that those collections would be held with the object collections with which they were associated. But our second largest number of responses again fell under other. And our responses to that were unknown, unsure, not applicable, or don't think that we have any, which matches up with the result that we saw that many respondents weren't certain if they had archive collections that would be useful. Next, we asked, based on your familiarity with NAGPRA, which of the following ways do you think archives can assist during the NAGPRA process? And most of our respondents, their common answer was that it would be useful for background research, and then assisting in providing evidence for NAGPRA claims. Next, we also had respondents say that archives could themselves be subject to repatriation. And then a smaller amount of respondents said that they weren't certain, and one person selected other, specifying that they thought archives could assist by providing access to these materials to researchers. And next, we got into our matrix section that Lisa alluded to. We asked, if you work for an institution that provides access to an archive collection, what policies and/or procedures does your institution have in place? So we first asked about documentation processes, and most of our respondents stated that they do have policies and/or procedures concerning their documentation processes. And then we had an even split between people who were developing their policies and procedures and who just did not have them. And then a small number of respondents said that they didn't know if they had policies and procedures in place for documentation processes. And we saw a major shift when we asked about tribal consultations. So here, our respondents said that they do not have policies and/or procedures when it comes to having tribal consultations. A smaller number of people responded that they were in the process of developing those policies and procedures. And then fewer respondents said that they already had policies and procedures in place. And again, a couple respondents were not sure if they had these or not. As far as reproduction policies went, we saw a big uptick in the number of respondents who have policies and procedures in place. So as you can see from the graph, we had 18 of our respondents say that they do have policies and procedures, and then very few comparatively said that they were developing, didn't have policies and procedures, or were uncertain. And the same held true for permissions to publish, where again, a high number of respondents had policies and procedures in place, and we saw an even split between developing, do not have, or uncertain. This continued to hold true to a lesser extent with physical handling. 16 respondents said that they have policies and procedures in place for physical handling. And fewer respondents said that they are developing or do not have policies and procedures, and no one was uncertain on this point. And the same held true again for preservation, as well as archival processing. We again saw that most of our respondents had policies and procedures in place for handling archival processing. No one was uncertain about this question, and very few respondents said that they don't have policies and procedures in places for this. So after that matrix, we then proceeded to ask what staffing positions make up your collaborating team when doing this type of work, and we asked our respondents to please select all that apply. And so it should come as no surprise, given that most of our respondents are archivists, that when we asked which staffing positions make up the collaborating team, by and far, most respondents said that an archivist was on the team. We again had quite a few other responses, which we'll move on to in a moment. And then we had a number of respondents say that their teams also included tribal representatives, NAGPRA officers, THPO officers, or archaeologists. And under that other category, we got a range of responses. So some people said they had collections manager and graduate students working on their team. Others said that they were working with special collections librarian or community historians. One person responded that their photographer makes up their collaborating team. And one respondent did also state that their staff of 2 is too small to have that many specialized positions, and that they wish that they had them. So as we wrapped up the survey, we gave our respondents a chance to respond to a couple of free text questions and answers. And the first question we asked in this section was, if you work for an institution that provides access to an archive collection, what are the challenges you face in doing this work? And we got some really great responses, and I have here pulled out a couple that were interesting to read. So one person responded that time continues to be the biggest struggle. I am what's known in the profession as a lone arranger, and I'm constantly trying to balance working with donors, assisting researchers, and supporting internal projects, in addition to ongoing care of the existing collections. Also, we are self-funding, not on the parent organization's budget, so we charge fees for access, which can be a difficult conversation. Another respondent stated that some of the collections that may be most useful to tribes in evidence for claims, such as oral histories, interviews, maps, and personal testimonies, are also data collected during human subjects research, which may be protected from access by other individuals from the tribe. and need guidance on how to proceed when federal, state, university, and tribal protocols may be in conflict. And so you can see there's a range of responses to the challenges that archivists were facing, both from the expected in terms of lack of resources to other issues. We next asked, if you are trying to access an archive collection, what are the challenges you face in doing this work? And when trying to access collections, one of our respondents stated that collections have been used for years by internal staff with no archival training. As a result, many of the collections lack a coherent order, and original order is always suspect. Inventories completed in the past, while certainly useful, vary in reliability. All of these factors together make it difficult to understand the full scope of a collection and where one should look when trying to locate information on a particular site, object, or time period. And then another respondent also stated that archives are backlogged with work. Large national collections tend to focus on providing access to other tribal regions, such as the Plains and Southwest, other cultural regions that are given little attention. Repositories located in a respective culture region should focus on providing access to collections to tribes in their vicinity, then branch out to neighboring tribal collections rather than focusing on tribes that have little to do with the regional history of where the repository is located. And then next, I will turn things over to Alejandra Gaeta, who will pull together more of these survey results in terms of correlating them across institutional type.
Thank you, Christina. Hi, everyone. My name is Alejandra Gaeta, and I'm the Associate Archivist and Librarian at the Autry Museum. For this review of the survey results, we look at the results based on the type of institution, archive, library, museum, tribal group, and other. The other category includes a national nonprofit organization and special collections. The survey respondents were first asked to identify their professional roles. So on the slide, as you can see, archivists were the majority, as Christina had previously mentioned. For the library respondents, we had archivists and librarians. For museums, we had archivists, NAGPRA officers, one who was a curator and the other one who was also an archaeologist, volunteer docent. We also had, for tribal groups, NAGPRA officer and THPO officer and collections manager. And for the other group, we had mostly archivists. So it is interesting to note that the respondents that identified as NAGPRA officers also included additional titles. So that was interesting. So the first question about the familiarity with NAGPRA, you can see in this first graph the different levels of familiarity that each category respondents had. The bars are color-coded to represent each of the types of institutions that responded. The majority of responses rest in the somewhat familiar section in the middle of the graph. Just one group responded that they weren't familiar with NAGPRA at all, and that was 50% of other. As you can see in the light blue bar at the top of the graph, 100% of tribal groups are extremely familiar, which is represented by the purple bar at the bottom of the graph. And the library respondents were generally familiar with NAGPRA, as you can see with the green bars, and it's the largest group in that particular section with 63% stating that they are somewhat familiar. And we see a similar graph for familiarity with PNAAM. The responses were spread more across the board, although there are more responses that are not at all familiar, with 50% of tribal groups, again, the purple bar. There are more respondents from a variety of institutions that stated that they were extremely familiar with PNAAM. We do have 33% of museums, which is the blue bar, and 14% of archives, which is the red bar, not at all familiar. But the rest tend to stay towards the bottom of the graph, which is between somewhat familiar and extremely familiar. It is interesting to note that 14% of archives were not at all familiar with PNAAM, considering that the protocols have been endorsed by the Society of American Archivists in the last couple of years. So in comparing familiarity with NAGPRA and PNAAM, we see that museum respondents were all familiar with NAGPRA and less familiar with PNAAM. A majority of archives respondents were more familiar with PNAAM than with NAGPRA. Library respondents were slightly more familiar with PNAAM, and a majority of this group were only somewhat familiar with NAGPRA. For tribal groups, they were extremely familiar with NAGPRA and not very familiar with PNAAM. And last but not least, the respondents in the other category were more familiar with PNAAM than NAGPRA. After a previous presentation of these results, an advisory group member pointed out that it was interesting to see that there was generally more familiarity with PNAAM overall than NAGPRA, despite the fact that NAGPRA is described in PNAAM. So that was an interesting point to see. The question about institutions having archive collections that can assist with NAGPRA claims. We have another graph similar to the previous two, which is color-coded to indicate the type of institution. At the top of the graph, we can see that a majority of the respondents were not sure if their institutions have archival collections that can assist with NAGPRA. We see 100% of other, which is the light blue, 75% of libraries, which is the green, 57% of archives, which is the red, and 50% of museums, which is the dark blue. 100% of tribal group respondents, purple bar here in the middle, do not have archival collections. And then you see at the bottom, there's a very small percentage of library, archive, and museum respondents that have indicated that their institutions do have collections that can assist with NAGPRA. So the following question about the location of these archive collections, you can see the options on the slide are listed to the left. So these are the options that were provided to the respondents in our library and archive repository. They are part of our acquisition / donor files with the object collections with which they are associated, not applicable or unsure. Overall, all the different types of institutions selected in our library and archive repository with a range of percentages. So for the archives, a little more than half, 57%, stated that the archive collections are in a library and archive repository. For the libraries, a majority stated that they are in the library and archive repository, with 13% stating that these collections are in their acquisition / donor files. Museums had the most variety of locations, so 33% are part of the acquisition / donor files. 17% were with object collections. And then again, they had also a small percentage in our library and archive repository. Tribal groups were split 50-50, so 50% in a library and archive repository, and the other 50 selected not applicable. It is interesting to note that just a little more than half of the archives respondents stated that their institution held these collections in the archive and or library repository. The remainder were split between with the object collections with which they are associated, and then they also, some respondents said not sure or not applicable. So with the following question about ways archives can assist during the NAGPRA process, the response options they were provided are listed on the left side of the slide, and they are background research, assisting in providing evidence, and then archives can be subject to repatriation and unsure. Overall, there was almost complete agreement with the first statement, background research, and then the agreement with the statement seemed to taper off. So for tribal groups, 100% responded and agreed to all three statements. For museums, 100% stated background research, providing evidence for claims, and 83% agreed that archives can be subject to repatriation, which is the next largest group to agree with that statement. For archives, only 86% stated background research, then 58% agreed that collections can assist in providing evidence for claims, and 43% stated that archive collections can be subject to repatriation. For libraries, 100% stated background research, 88% agreed that these collections could be useful for providing evidence for claims, and 50% stated archives can be subject to repatriation. So these next set of questions have to do with policies and procedures. And if these institutions have policies and procedures in place for certain processes. For some of these questions, I've grouped them together. I've grouped the questions themselves together if they could be related, or left them as separate questions. So the first question for this section of the survey was about documentation processes. A majority of the respondents have documentation processes, as you can see in the top left-hand corner square on the slide. Then there's an almost even split between responses stating they are developing documentation processes and not having them at all. You can see the similar percentages in the bottom left square and the top right square. And then a small percentage of museums and archives were unsure if their institutions had these processes in place. The next question about tribal consultations. Overall, a majority of respondents do not have policies and procedures concerning tribal consultations. The next largest set of responses were that their institutions are developing policies and procedures, which included a majority of archives respondents with 57% and 50% of tribal groups and other. For the next question, I grouped together reproduction policies and permissions to publish. The percentages on the left are for reproduction policies, and the ones that are on the right are for permissions to publish. Most respondents from all institution types have policies and or procedures concerning both of these, with over 50% at least from each group. 50% of tribal group respondents and 13% of libraries stated that they do not have policies and or procedures for reproduction or permissions to publish. And only 14% of archives do not have reproduction policies. Physical handling and preservation, again, were combined since they're could be tied together. And the responses for both of these questions were practically the same. So most museums, archives, libraries, and tribal group respondents stated that they have policies and or procedures concerning both of these processes. So museums, 50%, archives, 71%, libraries, 75%, and tribal groups, 100%. 100% of respondents in the other category are developing these procedures, and 25% of libraries do not have policies or procedures for physical handling. And with the other question, 25% were split evenly between preservation, with preservation on not having any policies or procedures dealing with preservation or developing them. It's interesting to note that only 50% of museums had these policies in place, and 33% are in the process of developing them. And with the final category of this particular question, archival processing, a majority of respondents, meaning at least 50% or more of each type of institution, stated that they do not have policies or procedures in place for archival processing. There was also a larger number that were developing them. So 33% of museums, 43% of archives, and 50% of other. A small percentage of museums and libraries did not have these policies at all. And it is interesting to see that a larger percentage of libraries compared to archives have policies and procedures for archival processing in place. And the next question about staffing positions. We have another graph for this following question. The respondents were asked what types of staffing positions would be included in a team handling this type of work at their institution. And the respondents were able to select multiple positions as well as select other and describe positions that weren't included as options. So what I've done here is combine the responses to illustrate the variety of positions according to the type of institution with another graph. The different color bars represent the staff positions that make up the collaborating team. So archivists were the largest group represented across the board, as can be seen with the red bar. Tribal representatives, the dark blue bar, were also included in teams across all the different institutions. NAGPRA officers, were the green bar, were included on teams in museums, tribal groups, and other. Archaeologists were included in teams in museums, libraries, tribal groups, and other. THPO officers were included in teams for archives, tribal groups, and other. And there were also a few other positions described by respondents, as you can see by the orange bar. It is important to note that a lot of these teams were limited to one person. A majority of the respondents described their teams being just one person or two or three, with a few having a much larger group depending on the size of their institution. So on this slide, you can see the different positions that were listed that were not included in the original list. So for museums, we had collections managers and graduate assistants. For archives, library administrators were mentioned, as well as an Office of Native Affairs, Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative from a university, as well as a photographer. For the library, we also had administrators mentioned, depending on the situation, special collections librarians, and a note from one respondent, as Christina previously mentioned, that they only have 2 staff members. The tribal group had mentioned a museum specialist / collections manager, and for other, we did have another special collections librarian and community historians. As Lisa and Christina had mentioned in the overview, the last 2 questions were free text responses. For some of these responses, I have been able to combine them based on the general themes, and for others, I've listed them just as they were written by the respondents. The most often mentioned challenges had to do with lack of resources, staff, and time, which prevented them from doing this work. Some of this then reflected in responses to previous questions. It explained why so many respondents were unsure if their institutions have archive collections that can assist with NAGPRA claims. As many mentioned, they had large backlogs and have been unable to process collections to be able to identify materials that could be useful for this work. Another challenge that a few respondents across institutions had was how to handle culturally responsive access. There was also a comment about having bureaucratic obstacles, whether that meant it was difficult to deaccession material because the original donor's family and or friends were on the board that was required to provide permission for deaccessions, or the respondent felt that they lacked institutional support to create culturally responsive policies and procedures. Another obstacle is digitization, which is important to provide access as well. And besides lack of resources to digitize the material, another issue was, again, with how to digitize in a culturally sensitive manner. There was also at least one comment about not being familiar with NAGPRA or related work, which leads to challenges providing access. Lack of staffing and time can also lead to obstacles in maintaining collections, which one commenter described as being unable to maintain records up to date. That included metadata, quality control of that sort of data. Another response was about needing to charge fees to provide access, as well as the slow process of providing reference, potentially making specifically Indigenous researchers feel that they were not being prioritized by the institution. The last 2 comments were specific to their commenters. As Christina mentioned earlier, there are some concerns about important data being restricted because of human subject studies. And one respondent from a tribal group mentioned that they are not providing access to outside entities during this time. And with the next access related question, it's from a slightly different perspective. Respondents were asked if they were trying to access an archive collection, what challenges would they face in doing this work? One of the most mentioned comments was a lack of processing of collections. Large backlogs mean that many institutions do not know fully what material they hold or what material may be useful for NAGPRA related work. Again, which could be tied back to the previous obstacles mentioned, which included lack of staff, time, and resources. Another related challenge is not having reliable documentation or collection descriptions, which again makes it difficult to know what collections might contain important data. As in the comment Christina highlighted previously, an archive respondent mentioned their repository overlooking local tribal communities and focusing on other tribal regions covered by larger national collections. Another archive respondent expanded on the challenge of providing culturally responsive access with a comment that they were unsure who to contact to review their collections in order to ensure they provided the right level of access to the material. Digitization was again mentioned with this question, with the major obstacle being access to proprietary digitization software for specifically 3D objects. Lack of time and necessity to travel were comments provided by library respondents and could be related to the lack of staffing and other obstacles that slow down reference or research requests that lead to poor quality experiences for researchers, as mentioned in the previous question. The cost of photocopies comment was made by a tribal group respondent and ties into a comment in the previous question about institutions charging fees for access. So fees for access and reproductions are the burden of researchers and could be a major challenge for this work. Lastly, a tribal group respondent also commented that there are disparities in naming schema, specifically with how an archive identifies their culture and cultural materials versus how they identify themselves and their cultural expressions. So finally, the last question was about following up. A majority of the respondents said yes, we can follow up and ask additional questions related to the survey and project, and also provided their contact information. That's the end of the correlation overview of the survey results, and I'll hand it back to Lisa to finish up our presentation.
We offer these results not as a definitive answer or answers, but as an attempt to continue the conversation, make observations, and connect with those who can benefit from this project. We would also like to use these results to prompt further discussions and gain more feedback, especially from those groups that are not well represented among the survey responders, such as tribal groups and non-archivists. To comment or send feedback about the results or to learn more about the Where Repatriation Meets the Protocols workbook project, please email rmpworkbook@gmail.com. Thank you for your time.